The ballroom at Hartwell Manor smelled like white lilies and candle wax, and I was standing 3 feet from the head table, holding a plain manila envelope, when my mother tapped her champagne glass with a spoon and asked 200 people to watch her humiliate me. My name is Vanessa Cole. I'm 33 years old, and I have spent my entire career as a hospital pharmacist, counting exact doses, because a single miscalculation can end a life. I never once imagined that the same precision would end up saving mine. In a room full of chandeliers, on the night my parents celebrated 40 years of marriage and tried to collect on 20 years of a debt I never actually owed them. The room had gone soft and golden the way these events always do. String lights looped along the ceiling beams, a jazz trio playing something slow near the bar, servers weaving between round tables with trays of champagne nobody needed more of. My father sat at the head table in a rented tuxedo he kept tugging at the collar of, looking proud in that stiff, uncomfortable way men look when they know they are supposed to feel something and are trying hard to perform it. My mother stood beside him in champagne-colored silk, her hand resting on his shoulder, and when she rose with her glass lifted, the whole room quieted the way rooms do for people who are used to being listened to. She thanked everyone for coming. She thanked God, she thanked the caterer, she thanked her sister for organizing the seating chart. Then her eyes moved across the room and landed on me, and I felt every hair on my arms rise the way they do in a code blue, that split second before you know something is about to go very wrong, very fast. She smiled the smile she has always used right before she asks me for something, warm on the surface, cold underneath, the kind of smile that has cost me more money and more sleep than I can count. Family takes care of family, she said into the microphone, her voice bright and practiced. And I know some of you have heard that your sister Bree's shop has hit a rough patch, but we're not worried because we have Vanessa, our responsible one, our reliable one. She's going to help us keep this family's business alive, aren't you, honey? Come on up here and sign the papers so everyone can see it done right, the way we raised you to do things. 200 faces turned toward me at once, and I felt the particular vertigo of being seen for the first time in years by people who had spent my entire life looking straight through me. Cousins I hadn't spoken to since college, my Aunt Denise, who once told me at a funeral that I was lucky to be the practical one, because pretty girls like Bree needed more help getting through life. My father's old business partners, men who used to shake my hand at graduations and forget my name by dessert. All of them were waiting, champagne glasses lifted, ready to watch the responsible daughter fall in line one more time. My sister Bree sat 2 seats down from my mother, in a dress that cost more than my last car payment, her eyes glassy with either wine or panic. I genuinely could not tell which. Beside her, my brother-in-law Marcus stared very hard at the tablecloth, the posture of a man who already knew exactly how much money was on the line, and exactly how badly they needed me to say yes in front of an audience big enough to make refusing feel impossible. I did not walk toward the microphone. I did not smile back. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the envelope I had been carrying against my ribs all night, the one that had been sitting in my lawyer's office for exactly 19 days, and I walked it slowly across the parquet floor and set it down beside my mother's champagne glass instead of my signature. The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent the way a hospital hallway goes silent right before an alarm, table by table, conversation by conversation, until even the trio near the bar let their last note trail off into nothing. My mother looked down at the envelope like it might bite her. She glanced back up at me, still smiling, still performing for the room, and said, "Sweetheart, what is this? We don't have time for this right now." And I said, quiet enough that only the head table could hear it clearly, but firm enough that every phone in the room had already started to come up. "Open it, Mom. It explains why I'm not signing anything tonight, or ever again." Before I tell you what was inside that envelope, and what it took to build the courage to bring it into that room, I need to take you back 25 years, to a kitchen table in a much smaller house, where the difference between my sister and me was decided before either of us had a say in it. If stories about being the overlooked one, the responsible one, the daughter who always paid and never got repaid hit close to home for you, stay with me, because what happened after that envelope was opened is the reason I finally started sleeping through the night again. And if you've ever been the family's ATM instead of the family's daughter, drop a comment and let me know, because I promise you are not alone in this, and I read every single one. Our house sat on Larkin Street, in a town called Fenwood, Ohio, the kind of place with one good diner and a 4th of July parade that took the same route every single year. My father sold insurance out of a strip mall office. My mother worked the front desk at a dentist's office 3 days a week and treated the other 4 days like a full-time job of managing our family's image. We were not poor, and we were not rich. We were the kind of family that mattered most in the middle, where every dollar had to be assigned a purpose before it was ever spent, and I learned very young exactly which purpose I had been assigned. Bree was born 18 months before me, and from the moment I have any memory of our house, it was clear which daughter the story was being written about. She had our mother's cheekbones and a laugh that filled a room, and by the time she was 6, she was already being entered into pageants 2 counties over, my mother spending Saturday afternoons curling her hair while I sat on the bathroom floor with a coloring book, waiting for someone to notice I existed too. I was quieter, more careful, the kind of kid who read the instructions before touching anything, and somewhere along the way, that got translated in my parents' minds into a kind of currency. Bree needed things. I could handle things. And handling things, I would learn, was not the same as being loved. I remember being 7 years old on my birthday, watching my mother set out a store-bought cake with my name misspelled in blue icing, Vanessa instead of Vanessa, and when I pointed it out gently, she just laughed and said, "Oh honey, it's the thought that counts. We can't all be Bree's cake, can we?" And everyone at the table laughed along with her, because that was the family joke by then, the running bit. Bree gets the good version, and Vanessa gets the version that still technically works. I laughed too. I always laughed too. That was part of the assignment. The clearest memory I carry from that whole stretch of childhood is a Tuesday afternoon in 4th grade when I brought home a perfect score on the state reading exam, the only one in my entire grade level, and I ran into the kitchen holding that paper like it was a winning lottery ticket, breathless, so proud I could barely get the words out. My mother was on the phone with her sister, and she held up one finger for me to wait, and then she kept talking for almost 10 more minutes about how Bree had been chosen to sing a solo in the spring recital. By the time she hung up, I had folded my paper into smaller and smaller squares, and when I finally handed it to her, she glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds and said, "That's nice, sweetie. Now go find your good shoes. We have to get your sister to rehearsal." That's nice. Sweetie became something I heard so often it stopped registering as words at all. It became more like weather, something that simply happened around me, while the real forecast, the one that mattered, was always centered on my sister. Every dollar in that house followed the same current. Bree got dance lessons and later voice lessons, and later a car for her 16th birthday. A used Honda, but still a car, washed and waiting in the driveway with a bow on it, while relatives gathered to watch her scream with joy. I got her hand-me-down bicycle 2 years later, with the seat lowered to fit me, and my father told me I should be grateful, because some kids didn't get bikes at all. I want to be honest with you, because I think this is the part people misunderstand about families like mine. It was never one big cruel moment. Nobody ever sat me down and said, "We love your sister more than we love you." It was 1,000 small withdrawals from an account nobody ever told me I had, until one day I looked up and realized the balance had been 0 for years, and I had simply adjusted my expectations to match it. I stopped bringing home report cards to show anyone. I stopped mentioning when I made the honor roll 3 years running, because I had learned that announcing it only invited the comparison, and the comparison always ended the same way, with me somehow being reminded that Bree was still trying so hard, and I should be understanding, because not everyone finds things as easy as I apparently did. My father had a phrase he used whenever I got brave enough, usually once a year around report card season, to ask why things were so different for Bree and me. He would set down his newspaper, look at me over his reading glasses, and say the same sentence almost word for word every single time. Vanessa, you're the strong one. You don't need the same things Bree needs. Some kids need more support to get where they're going, and some kids just get there on their own. I used to think that was a compliment. I carried it around like a badge for years. The strong one. The reliable one. The one who didn't need extra. It took me until I was almost 30 to understand what that sentence actually meant, translated out of the language of a family that had already decided where its resources were going. It meant we have already chosen who we are investing in, and it is not you, and we need you to be fine with that. So we are going to dress the decision up as a compliment and hand it to you like a gift. By the time I was in middle school, I had quietly assigned myself a new job in that household, the job of being no trouble at all. I made my own lunches. I set my own alarm. I learned to do my own laundry at 11 because my mother was always at some rehearsal or pageant fitting for Bree, and nobody ever asked if I minded. When my grandfather, my father's own father, would call the house on Sundays, I noticed something strange even then, that he always asked specifically for me, that he remembered which grade I was in and what I was reading, while my parents hovered near the phone with a kind of tension I did not understand yet, my father's jaw tightening every single time that call came through. I did not know then that my grandfather and my father barely spoke outside of those Sunday calls, or that there was an old wound between them. Neither of them had ever properly named out loud. I only knew that when Grandpa Cole asked how I was doing, he actually waited for the answer, and that felt so foreign in that house that I used to hold the phone a little closer to my ear during those calls, savoring 10 unremarkable minutes about my science homework the way other kids might savor a birthday. I want you to sit with that image for a second. An 11-year-old girl leaning against a kitchen wall, phone cord stretched to its limit, treasuring the only 10 minutes a week where someone on the other end genuinely wanted to know how her day went. Because that phone cord, and that grandfather, and those Sunday calls nobody else in the house paid attention to, turned out to matter more than anyone in my family could have possibly imagined at the time. If you had a Grandpa Cole in your life, someone who saw you when nobody else bothered to look, drop his name or hers in the comments right now, because I think that kind of love deserves to be said out loud, and I promise you, it changes everything that comes next in this story. I left Fenwood 3 days after I turned 18, and I want to be clear that nobody threw me out, and nobody drove me anywhere in the dead of night with garbage bags on a porch. It was quieter than that, and in some ways that made it harder to explain to people later, because there was no single dramatic scene I could point to and say, this is the moment they showed me who I was to them. There was just a slow, steady understanding that had been building since I was 7 years old with a misspelled birthday cake, and by the time I packed my car with everything I owned, which fit easily in the back seat and half the trunk, I already knew I was not leaving a home so much as I was leaving a waiting room where I had spent my whole childhood expecting a turn that was never actually coming. My mother hugged me in the driveway the morning I left for Ohio State, and it was a real hug, arms and all, and she told me to call when I got there, and I remember standing in that hug thinking, this is probably the last time I will feel like her daughter in the same way Bree gets to feel like her daughter every single day. My father shook my hand, actually shook my hand like I was a coworker leaving for a new job, and told me he was proud of me for being so independent, which even then I understood was just another way of saying, we never had to worry about you, which was another way of saying, we never had to invest in you, which was the truest sentence in that entire goodbye, and the one nobody said out loud. I paid for college with a patchwork of scholarships, a part-time job shelving inventory at a campus pharmacy, and loans that would follow me for the next 12 years. My parents helped Bree with her tuition at a private art school 2 states away, the kind of school with a name that looked impressive on a tote bag, and when I mentioned once, carefully, gently, that I might need a little help covering the gap between my scholarships and my actual bill, My mother told me that Bree's program was simply more expensive, and that I was so much better at managing money than your sister is. Honey, you'll figure it out. You always do. I did figure it out. I worked 30 hours a week on top of a full course load, and I graduated with more debt than I want to say out loud even now. And Bree graduated 2 years later from a program she never actually used, because by then, she had already found her true calling, which according to her, at every family dinner for the next decade, was always exactly one investment away from finally taking off. The pharmacy that hired me for my first real job after my doctorate was a small independent shop in Columbus, tucked between a laundromat and a nail salon, run by a woman named Rosalind Ferris, who had been filling prescriptions in that same building for almost 30 years. Rosalind was blunt, in a way that startled me at first, and then became the thing I trusted most about her. She caught me apologizing for asking a question during my first week, actually apologizing, the way I had learned to apologize for existing in my parents' kitchen, and she stopped what she was doing, looked at me over the counter, and said, "Why on earth are you sorry for wanting to learn how to do your job correctly? Nobody in this building is keeping score against you, Vanessa." And I remember standing there blinking at her because keeping score against me was the only kind of attention I had ever really known. Rosalind became the first person in my adult life who treated competence as something to be nurtured, rather than something to be quietly harvested. She sent me to continuing education courses on her own dime and never once brought it up like a debt I owed her. When I finally passed my board exams and became fully licensed, she closed the shop early on a Tuesday and took the whole staff out for barbecue, and she stood up in that crowded little restaurant and told everyone, unprompted, that I was one of the sharpest pharmacists she had ever trained, and that the hospital system was lucky to be getting me a few months later when I moved on. Nobody had ever bragged about me out loud like that in my entire life. I went home that night and cried in my car in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes, not because I was sad, but because I genuinely did not have a category in my brain for what pride directed at me felt like, and my body did not know what to do with it except leak. Through all of this, the only steady thread connecting me back to Fenwood was Grandpa Cole. He wrote letters, actual letters, in handwriting that got shakier every year, always ending with the same line, "Tell me something true, Vanessa, not the polished version, the real one." So I did. I told him about failing my first pharmacology exam and having to retake it. I told him about the year I ate ramen 4 nights a week to afford my licensing fees. I told him about Rosalind and the barbecue, and how strange it felt to be praised without a catch attached. He wrote back every single time within a week, and every letter had $10 folded inside it no matter how many times I told him he didn't need to, along with some small piece of wisdom that always landed harder than he probably intended. Sentences like, "The people who love you correctly will never make you feel like a bill they're trying to collect on." Or, "Don't confuse being useful to someone with being loved by them. They are not the same currency, and only one of them will still be there when you have nothing left to give." I did not fully understand why my father and my grandfather barely spoke, only that there had been some falling out over the family pharmacy business decades earlier. Something about my grandfather refusing to hand my father control of it when he wanted it. A decision my father had apparently never forgiven him for. I only knew what filtered through in careful half-sentences at holidays, my mother always changing the subject the moment Grandpa Cole's name came up too directly, my father's face going flat and closed, in a way I recognized because it was the same expression he wore whenever I asked too many questions about anything that mattered. By the time I was 28, I had built something that was entirely, undeniably mine, a senior clinical pharmacist position at a major hospital system, a small but solid savings account, a 1-bedroom apartment I had furnished piece by piece with my own paychecks, nothing borrowed, nothing owed. I had done exactly what my father predicted I would do. I had gotten there on my own, and somewhere along the way, I had stopped waiting for anyone from Fenwood to notice. And yet every few months, almost like clockwork, my phone would light up with my mother's name, usually not to ask how I was doing, but to ask, gently at first and then less gently, whether I could help Bree with rent this month, or cover a car repair, or float them a little something until Marcus's commission check came through. Because family takes care of family, honey, and you're doing so well now. I gave because that is what the strong one does. After all, 20 years of training is not something you unlearn just because you finally have money in the bank to say no with. I gave quietly, without keeping a running tally, without asking Bree to ever pay any of it back, because some part of me still believed that if I gave enough, eventually the scale would tip, and I would stop being the family's safety net, and finally become its daughter. I had no idea, standing in my apartment, writing another check I told myself was the last one, that the man who had spent 2 decades sending me $10 bills in shaky handwriting had been quietly building something of his own, something he intended, in the end, to hand entirely to me. If you've ever felt like the strong one in your family was just a polite word for the one nobody worried about disappointing, stay with me, because the next part of this story is the moment everything I thought I understood about my family's math got turned completely upside down, and I want you to be here for it. The call came on a Thursday in March, while I was finishing a med reconciliation on the 7th floor, and I almost let it go to voicemail because the number on my screen wasn't saved, just a Fenwood area code I hadn't seen light up my phone in years. Something made me answer it anyway, some instinct I still don't fully understand, and a woman's voice on the other end introduced herself as a nurse at Fenwood Regional, and asked, very gently, in the tone I now recognize professionally as the one we all use when we're about to say something a family doesn't want to hear, whether I was Vanessa Cole, granddaughter of Walter Cole. I said yes before she even finished the sentence, and she told me my grandfather had suffered a stroke 2 days earlier and had been asking for me by name since he regained consciousness, and that given his age and the severity of it, if I wanted to see him, I probably shouldn't wait. I drove the 4 hours to Fenwood that same night with my hands locked at 10 and 2 the entire way, radio off, replaying every letter he had ever sent me as I could somehow will myself back through time to the last one. The one still sitting unanswered on my kitchen counter because I had been too busy that week to write back. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I hadn't even told him I finally paid off my last student loan, that I had been saving that news for the next letter, like a present I wanted to open with him, instead of just mailing it, and now I might not get the chance. And that thought alone nearly took the wheel out of my hands somewhere around the Ohio border. Nobody from my immediate family had called to tell me. I found that out standing in the hospital parking lot, phone pressed to my ear, my mother's voice going tight and defensive when I asked why I'd had to hear it from a nurse instead of from her. "We didn't want to worry you, Vanessa," she said. "You're always so busy with work. And besides, your father and his father were never exactly close. You know that." And I remember standing in that cold parking lot thinking, he is dying, and you decided on my behalf that I didn't need to know. The same way you decided on my behalf what I needed my whole childhood. And somehow the math always comes out the same, doesn't it? Somehow I am always the one who gets left out of the room where the decisions get made. My grandfather's room on the 3rd floor smelled like antiseptic, and the particular staleness of a body that has been lying still for 2 days, and when I walked in, he was smaller than I remembered. The left side of his face pulled slightly downward, one hand curled loosely at his side, but his eyes found mine the second the door opened, and something in them cleared, sharpened, like a man surfacing from underwater. "Charlie," he said, "except my name is Vanessa," and I realized after a moment, throat tight, that Charlie had been my father's childhood nickname, and in that confused, drug-softened moment, he had reached backward for the son he wished had turned out differently, and found me standing there instead, which felt like the saddest and most accurate metaphor for my entire family that I had ever been handed. I sat with him for 3 days straight, sleeping in the vinyl chair beside his bed, running back to my hospital in Columbus, only long enough to arrange emergency leave, because I was not going to let him wake up alone in that room, the way I had spent so much of my childhood feeling alone in a house full of people. My parents came exactly once, on the 2nd day, and stayed for 11 minutes. I counted, because counting things has always been how I survive rooms that hurt me. My father stood near the door the entire time, hands in his pockets, and said almost nothing beyond a stiff, "You're looking well, Dad," before checking his watch twice, and suggesting to my mother that they should probably let him rest. Bree never came at all. She sent a text to the family group chat that said, "Sending prayers, so hard to see him like this," followed by a crying emoji, and I remember staring at that message on my phone in the vinyl chair, my grandfather's hand loose in mine, and feeling something in my chest go very quiet and very cold. On the third night, close to midnight, his good hand tightened around mine hard enough to wake me from the shallow half-sleep I'd been drifting in and out of. His speech was slurred, but clear enough to follow if you leaned in close and had spent your whole life learning to listen for the parts of people that mattered, underneath the parts that were struggling to come out. He told me there was a safe deposit box at the First Fenwood Trust, box number 214, and that the key was taped inside the back cover of the leather-bound dictionary on the shelf in his study, the one I used to pull down as a kid, to look up words I was too proud to ask an adult to explain to me. He told me not to tell my father about the box until after the will was read, and when I asked why, his grip tightened again and he said, "Because your father will try to talk you out of what's in it, before you even get the chance to understand what it means, and I need you to understand it first, Vanessa, before anyone else gets a say." I asked him what was in the box, and he was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting toward the window, where the parking lot lights buzzed orange against the dark. And then he said something I have replayed in my head every single day since. "I built something your father never wanted, and your sister never earned," he said, "and I built it thinking of you the entire time, because you were the only one who ever asked how I was doing, and actually waited to hear the answer. That's nothing, Charlie. That's everything. That's the whole inheritance right there. And everything else is just paperwork catching up to it." He asked me for one more thing that night, and it's the thing that changed the entire shape of what came after. He asked me to bring him a small spiral notebook from the nightstand drawer, and with his good hand shaking, letters slanting and uneven, he wrote something down across 2 pages, folded it twice, and told me to give it to nobody, not even him again, until I sat in front of a lawyer named Preston Yates whose office was 3 doors down from the bank. "Preston," he said, "already knows what's coming. He's known for 11 years. All you have to do is walk in and hand him that page, and everything else will explain itself." He passed away 4 days later, quietly, in his sleep, with me in the vinyl chair beside him, and a nurse's hand resting briefly on my shoulder, as the monitor finally went still. My father cried at the funeral, real tears, the kind I had genuinely never seen from him before, and some small, stubborn part of me wanted to believe it meant something had finally cracked open in him. But 3 days after we buried Walter Cole, before the will had even been formally read, before anyone had any legal right to know a single detail of what he'd left behind, my mother called me sounding warmer than she had in years, asking if I'd heard anything yet about the estate, and reminding me, gently, that family should always stick together during hard times like these, especially, she added, with everything going on with your sister's shop right now. If you've ever had a grandparent who saw exactly who you were before the rest of your family caught up and left you something that proved it, tell me about them in the comments, because what was waiting for me in that safe deposit box was about to explain 25 years of my life all at once, and I need you to understand exactly what my family did next, because it started before we had even properly grieved him. Preston Yates's office sat exactly where my grandfather said it would. 3 doors down from First Fenwood Trust, above a shoe repair shop with a bell over the door that jingled when I walked in, still wearing the black dress I'd worn to the funeral the day before. He was younger than I expected, maybe 50, with the kind of careful stillness lawyers develop after decades of watching families come apart over paper. I handed him the folded page from the spiral notebook without a word, and I watched his face as he read it, watched something in his jaw settle like a man finally allowed to exhale after holding his breath for over a decade. He looked up at me and said, "I've been waiting 11 years for someone to walk through that door with this exact piece of paper, Miss Cole, and I want you to sit down, because this is going to take a while, and I need you steady for it." What my grandfather had built, quietly, patiently, over the last 20 years of his life, was Cole Specialty Pharmaceuticals, a compounding and medical supply company that had started as a single storefront and grown into a regional distributor supplying 3 hospital systems across 2 states, including, though I hadn't known it until that afternoon, the very hospital system I worked for in Columbus. Preston slid a folder across the desk, with numbers in it that made my hands go cold. A business valued at just over $4 million, along with a separate personal investment account he had built alongside it, and a modest house in Fenwood that had been paid off for 15 years. He had left almost the entirety of it to me, not split evenly between his grandchildren the way I might have expected, not divided down some polite family line, but to me specifically, named, with a letter attached explaining exactly why, and one single condition folded into the trust documents that Preston said my grandfather had insisted on adding 11 years earlier and had never once wavered from since. The condition was this: I would inherit everything outright and immediately, with full control, on one binding requirement: that none of the assets, not the business, not the investment account, not the house, could ever be used to pay off, guarantee, co-sign, or otherwise financially rescue any existing or future debt belonging to my sister Bree or her husband Marcus. If I violated that clause in any way, the entire estate would be redirected automatically to a scholarship fund for first-generation pharmacy students that Preston had already drawn up the paperwork for 11 years ago and simply been waiting to activate. My grandfather had watched, from a distance, for over a decade, exactly the pattern I had lived inside my whole life without fully naming it, and he had built a legal wall specifically to protect me from being drained the way he must have known, somehow, I would eventually be asked to be drained. I sat in that office and read the letter he'd left me twice through before I could get past the second paragraph without my voice catching. He wrote that he had watched my father make the same mistake with money that his own father had made with him decades earlier, treating one child's needs as bottomless and another child's strength as an excuse to stop paying attention. He wrote that he'd started truly building the company the year I graduated high school, not because he suddenly had extra money to spend, but because he wanted to prove to me, eventually, in the only language our family seemed to actually understand, that being the responsible one was never supposed to mean being the invisible one, and that somebody had been keeping score after all, just not the way I thought. The last line of the letter said, "Don't let them tell you that loving them means emptying yourself for them. I built this so you'd never have to choose between the two again." I did not tell my parents, not that week, not the next, partly because I needed time to sit with it myself, and partly because some old, careful instinct in me, the same one that used to fold report cards into smaller and smaller squares, told me that the moment this information left the room, it would stop being mine to process and start being a resource for someone else to manage. I was right to wait, though I didn't fully understand how right, until 3 weeks later, when Bree called me crying so hard I could barely make out the words, telling me her boutique, the one my parents had helped her open 2 years earlier with a second mortgage on their own house, was going to lose its lease unless she came up with $63,000 within the month, and that Marcus's business partner had already pulled out, and the bank was calling, and Mom said maybe, just maybe, if things ever changed for me financially, I might be able to help, because family takes care of family, right, Vanessa? That's what we do. I told her I was sorry things were so hard, and I did not mention the letter sitting in a locked drawer in my apartment, or the $4 million valuation, or the condition attached to every dollar of it. I told her I would think about what I could do, which was true, because what I was thinking about was exactly how far this family was willing to go once they found out what I actually had. I did not have to wait long to find out. It was Marcus, not Bree, who slipped first. He posted something in a family group chat meant, I'm almost certain, for a different thread entirely, A message that stayed visible for exactly 4 minutes before he deleted it. But 4 minutes was more than enough time for 3 separate relatives, including my Aunt Denise, to screenshot it and eventually let it find its way to me. The message read, "Mom says Vanessa's grandpa left her some kind of pharmacy business worth millions. We just need to get her to the party before she talks to a lawyer and locks it up somewhere we can't touch. Bree's shop closes in 10 days if we don't get real money moving." I read that message standing in my own kitchen, the same kitchen I had built entirely with my own money, and I felt something in my chest go very still, very cold, the same stillness I'd felt in that hospital parking lot when my mother told me they hadn't wanted to worry me about my own grandfather dying. They had already been planning the anniversary party for months, a 40th wedding celebration my mother had been talking about since Christmas. 200 guests, a rented ballroom, the whole extravagant production. What I understood now, reading that message over and over on my kitchen counter, was that somewhere in the last 3 weeks, that party had quietly transformed into something else entirely. A stage built specifically to put me on the spot, in front of enough witnesses that saying no would feel impossible. Exactly the way my mother's toasts and speeches had always worked my whole life, dressed up as celebration, functioning as pressure. They were not inviting me to their 40th anniversary. They were inviting me to my own ambush, and they had scheduled it before I even had the chance to see it coming. If you've ever watched a family group chat message expose exactly how much someone was worth to the people who claim to love them unconditionally, comment the word "screenshot" below, because what I did next started the moment I closed that message and called Preston Yates back, and told him I needed help building something they would never see coming. Preston listened to the whole thing without interrupting once, and when I finished reading him Marcus's message word for word over the phone, there was a long pause on the line before he said, in the same measured voice he'd used the day he handed me my grandfather's letter, "Vanessa, I want you to understand something clearly before we go any further. You already hold every card in this situation. The trust is airtight, the condition is binding. There is legally nothing they can do to force your hand. The only question left is whether you want to walk away quietly and let them find out through paperwork, or whether you want to walk in and let them find out in a room full of the exact people they've spent your whole life performing for." I told him I wanted the second option, and he was quiet again for a moment, before he said, "Then let's build it properly, because if you're going to do this, you only get one chance to do it right." The first thing I did was pull every receipt. Not metaphorically. I mean, I sat at my kitchen table for 3 consecutive nights, with my laptop and a shoebox of old bank statements, and built a spreadsheet that made my hands shake by the time I finished it. Every transfer I had sent my parents over the last 8 years, dated, labeled, totaled at the bottom in a number that made me physically sick to look at. $41,300, sent in increments of 200 here, 500 there, once a full 3,000 the year Marcus's car got repossessed. Every single time framed as a temporary favor between family and never once repaid, never once even acknowledged again after the crisis passed. I had genuinely never added it up before. I had been too busy giving to ever stop and count what giving had cost me, and seeing that number in black and white on my own screen did something to me that I don't think I fully processed until months later. Preston helped me pull the second piece, which was colder and more clinical, but somehow hit even harder. A full credit and lending history search his paralegal ran with my written consent, tracing every loan my parents had taken out or co-signed in the last decade. A second mortgage on the Larkin Street house, taken out 2 years ago to fund Bree's boutique lease and initial inventory. A personal loan from a regional bank, also co-signed by my parents, that Bree and Marcus had already defaulted on twice, with the bank sending formal notices to my parents' address as the guarantors of record. A business line of credit, opened under Marcus's name but backed by my father's retirement account as collateral, is currently sitting at 87% utilized. My family was not simply asking me for help. My family had already bled themselves nearly dry trying to keep Bree's business alive, and I was the last untapped account they had left, the one Marcus's leaked message had made painfully clear they intended to access before I even had the chance to protect myself. I asked Preston what would happen legally if I did sign anything that night at the party, if the pressure of that room somehow broke something in me the way it always had my whole life, and he told me plainly that any signature obtained under that kind of orchestrated public pressure could later be challenged, but that the far cleaner path, the one that protected everyone including me, was to simply never let the pen touch the paper in the first place. So we built a document instead. Not a signature they were expecting, but one they had absolutely no idea was coming. Preston drafted a formal notarized statement summarizing the full history I had just spent 3 nights assembling, the $41,000 given without repayment, the co-signed loans, the defaulted payments, the leaked message from Marcus laying out their plan in his own words, and the terms of my grandfather's trust explaining, in plain, unambiguous legal language, exactly why I was legally barred from ever bailing out Bree's business, even if I wanted to. While Preston worked on the language, I did the part that scared me more than any of it, the part that had nothing to do with lawyers. I called my grandfather's old business, now technically mine, and spoke for the first time with the general manager he had trained personally, a steady, kind woman named Dolores Whitfield, who had worked beside him for 18 years. I told her who I was, and she started crying on the phone before I even finished my sentence, telling me he used to talk about me constantly, that half the framed photos in his office at the warehouse were pictures Diane had sent him over the years, my college graduation, my white coat ceremony, photos I never even knew he had copies of. She told me the business was healthy, profitable, exactly as strong as Preston's numbers suggested, and that whenever I was ready, whatever I decided to do with it, the team was ready to work with me. That call cracked something open in me that all the spreadsheets hadn't managed to touch, the plain, simple fact that somewhere quietly, for years, my worth had already been documented by someone who actually paid attention, long before I ever had proof of it in my own hands. 2 nights before the anniversary party, my mother called me, and her voice had shifted again into that same warm register I remembered from the hospital parking lot phone call, except sweeter now, more urgent underneath it. She told me how excited she was for me to see the ballroom, how she'd found the most beautiful centerpieces, how it would mean the world to your father to have the whole family together for such a big night, and then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that Bree's lawyer had drawn up some simple guarantor paperwork, just in case anyone wanted to help out with the shop situation. Nothing pressured, of course, just available if the mood struck, and wouldn't it be wonderful if the whole family could celebrate 2 happy things at once? I listened to every word of it, with the leaked message still open in a separate tab on my laptop. We just need to get her to the party before she talks to a lawyer, and I said, "Sure, Mom, I'll be there. Sounds like a beautiful night." Preston finished the final document the morning of the party, printed and notarized, sealed inside a plain manila envelope, along with certified copies of the trust conditions and a single page summarizing, in 6 clean bullet points, exactly what my family had done and exactly why it was never going to work. He asked me one more time, standing in his office doorway as I tucked the envelope into my bag, whether I was sure I wanted to do this in front of everyone, rather than through the mail, quietly, privately, the way most people handle things like this. I told him what I had been turning over in my head for 3 straight nights, the same sentence my grandfather had written in his letter, that I finally understood in my bones. They spent 25 years deciding what happened to me in front of an audience, I said. So tonight, I'm going to let the audience decide what happens to them. If you've ever built a folder, an envelope, a receipt, anything at all, before finally standing up to the people who spent your whole life underestimating you, comment the word "ready" below, because the ballroom doors were about to open, and I was walking in with everything I needed already in my hands. My mother's hand hovered over the envelope for a long moment before she picked it up, and I watched something flicker across her face, that same look she used to get whenever a plan wasn't unfolding the way she had scripted it in her head beforehand. The microphone was still in her other hand, still live, still catching every breath in the room, and I think some instinct told her to set it down. But pride or panic or 25 years of habit made her keep it pressed close instead, which meant that whatever happened next was going to happen for 200 witnesses, whether she wanted it to or not. She tore the seal and pulled out the papers, and I watched her eyes drop to the first line, watched her read the words Cole's Specialty Pharmaceuticals, watched the number $4 million land somewhere behind her expression before she even had the chance to compose herself for the crowd still watching her. "What is this?" she said again, quieter this time, the microphone still catching every word, her voice losing the polished warmth from a minute earlier. I stepped closer, close enough that only the head table could hear me clearly, though by now every phone in the room had come up, every conversation at every table had gone silent, and the string trio had stopped playing entirely, the violinist just standing there with her bow lowered, watching. "That's the estate Grandpa Cole left me," I said. "All of it, legally mine, no strings, except for one condition he built in himself 11 years ago, which is that none of it can ever be used to guarantee, co-sign, or pay off any debt belonging to Bree or Marcus. It's all in there. The trust language, the notary seal, everything." My father stood up beside her, tugging at his collar again, his voice pitched somewhere between confusion and warning. "Vanessa, this isn't the place," he said, and I looked at him, really looked at him, the way I hadn't let myself look at him in years, and I said, "You're right, Dad, it isn't the place. And yet here we all are, because you and Mom decided this was exactly the place to ask me to sign away money I don't even legally control anymore, in front of 200 people, so that saying no would feel impossible. I just wanted everyone here to understand why the answer was always going to be no, even before I found out about any of this." Bree stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor, and she was crying already. The kind of crying that comes fast and desperate rather than sad, mascara already streaking. "You don't understand what we're going through," she said, her voice cracking. "We're going to lose everything. The shop, the house, everything. And you're standing there with millions of dollars, acting like we're strangers to you. We're your family, Vanessa. How could you do this to us at Mom and Dad's anniversary?" I felt the old reflex rise in my chest, the one trained into me since I was 7 years old, the urge to apologize, to soften it, to fold myself smaller so the room could breathe easier. And I made myself stand still against it, the way I had practiced with Preston 3 separate times that week. I pulled the second document out of my clutch, the one with the 6 bullet points, and I read them out loud into the silence, because Preston had told me, "If you're going to say it once, clearly, and let it stand on its own." $41,300, given to this family over 8 years, never repaid. 3 co-signed loans currently in default, all guaranteed against Mom and Dad's retirement and their house. A leaked message from Marcus, dated 3 weeks ago, stated the plan was to get me to this party before I could talk to a lawyer and lock the estate up somewhere they couldn't touch it. I looked up from the page and found Marcus's eyes across the table, and he had gone the color of the tablecloth, his mouth opening and closing without a single word coming out of it. The room had gone so quiet I could hear ice settling in someone's glass 3 tables away. My Aunt Denise had her hand pressed flat over her mouth. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in a decade was filming on her phone, not even trying to hide it anymore. My mother finally set the microphone down on the table, but it was too late. The damage of every word had already carried, and she turned to me with something in her face I had genuinely never seen before. Not anger exactly. Something closer to a woman watching a story she had told herself for 25 years come apart in real time, in front of the only audience that had ever mattered to her. "We were only trying to help your sister," my mother said, her voice smaller now, stripped of the performance, and I said, "I know, Mom, you've spent $41,000 of my money and 2 mortgages worth of your own, trying to help her, and it still wasn't enough. Because the problem was never a lack of money. The problem is that nobody in this family ever learned how to run a business, or how to stop leaning on the one daughter you decided could handle anything. That's not cruelty, Mom. That's just what the last 8 years actually cost. I just finally added it up. Bree was still crying, and I turned to her, and something in me softened just slightly, because underneath everything, she was still my sister, still the little girl with the good cheekbones, who never asked to be turned into the family's favorite investment, any more than I asked to be turned into its collateral. Bree, I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected it to be. I am not the reason your shop is closing, and I was never going to be the reason it stayed open either. That was never a fair weight to put on either of us, and I think some small part of you has known that for a while. My father sat back down slowly, the fight visibly draining out of him, and for one long moment he just looked at the tablecloth in front of him, the same way he used to look at his newspaper right before delivering that old line about me being the strong one. When he finally looked up at me, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it in my entire life. Your grandfather always said we'd regret it someday, he said. The way we split things between you girls. He said it at every holiday for 20 years, and I never once listened to him. I looked at my father, this man who had spent 4 decades deciding I needed less because I asked for less, and I said the only thing left to say. The sentence I had been carrying in my chest since that hospital room in Fenwood. He wasn't talking about splitting money evenly, Dad. He was talking about splitting attention evenly. The money was the only language this family ever learned how to say it in. I picked my clutch back up off the table, and I looked around the room one last time, at Bree crying into Marcus's shoulder, at my mother staring down at $4 million worth of paperwork she would never be able to touch, at 200 faces still frozen mid-gasp around a room that had gone completely, permanently silent, and I said the last thing I had come there to say, quiet enough that only the head table could hear it, calm enough that it landed harder than shouting ever could have. Happy anniversary, I said, and I walked back out through the ballroom doors the same way I had walked in 20 minutes earlier, except this time, for the first time in 25 years, I did not look back to see if anyone was following me. The parking lot outside Hartwell Manor was cold and quiet, and I sat in my car for almost 15 minutes before my hands finally stopped shaking enough to trust them on the wheel. My phone had already started buzzing before I even got the key in the ignition, message after message flooding in from cousins and aunts who had watched the whole thing unfold in real time, some of them furious on my parents' behalf, more of them, quietly, gently, telling me things I had genuinely never heard before, that they always thought it was strange how differently Bree and I had been treated growing up, that they had never known how to say anything about it, that they were proud of me for finally saying it myself. I did not answer any of them that night. I drove home to Columbus with the radio off again, the same way I had driven to that hospital 4 months earlier, except this time, the silence in the car felt different, felt like something settling into place instead of something bracing for impact. The fallout in Fenwood took about 6 weeks to fully play out, and I learned most of it secondhand through Dolores at the pharmacy business, who had her own network of friends still living in the same small town orbit my parents had spent their whole lives circling. Bree's boutique closed permanently within the month, exactly as everyone had feared, though not because of anything I did or didn't sign that night, but because the business had never actually been sustainable in the first place, propped up on borrowed money and borrowed time for 2 straight years. Marcus and Bree filed for personal bankruptcy that spring, and the second mortgage on my parents' house came due not long after, forcing them to sell the Larkin Street house I grew up in and downsize into a much smaller place on the other side of town, the kind of quiet, humbling come-down that a community like Fenwood does not let you have privately. My mother tried calling me 3 times in the 2 weeks after the party, and I let all 3 go to voicemail, not out of cruelty, but because Preston had gently reminded me that I did not owe anyone immediate access to me, simply because they had spent 25 years assuming they always would have it. When I finally did call her back, a month later, on my own schedule instead of hers, the conversation was shorter and more honest than any conversation we'd had in years. She did not apologize outright, Not in the clean, complete way I might have once hoped for, but she said something close to it. Something about how she and my father had spent so long trying to make sure Bree didn't struggle, that they never stopped to ask whether I was struggling too. Quietly, invisibly, in all the ways that don't show up as tears at a dinner table. It was not everything, it was something. I decided, for now, to let it be enough of a start. My father surprised me more. He called on a Sunday afternoon, 2 months after the party, and his voice on the phone sounded older than I remembered, softer around the edges, in a way that made me think of my grandfather's voice in that hospital bed, reaching for a version of him that had gotten lost somewhere along the way. He told me he'd been going through some of his father's old letters, the ones Grandpa Cole had kept copies of over the years, and he'd found one addressed to me from when I was 14, one I apparently never received, tucked into a drawer instead. And in it, my grandfather had written about being proud of a science fair project I'd built that year, one nobody at home had ever asked me a single question about. My father read me that letter over the phone, his voice catching twice, and at the end of it he said, "I should have been the one telling you that, Vanessa, all those years, and I'm sorry it took losing him and nearly losing everything else for me to finally see it." I kept the pharmacy business, and I did not sell it, though Preston told me more than once that I could have, that a company that size would have brought in a substantial buyout if I'd wanted to simply walk away with the money and never think about Fenwood again. I did not want that. I flew up to the warehouse 2 weekends a month for almost a year, learning the operations side of the business alongside Dolores, sitting in on distribution meetings, understanding for the first time what my grandfather had actually spent his last 2 decades quietly building, while everyone in his own family assumed he was simply a stubborn old man who never let go of a grudge. What I found instead was a company built with the same careful precision my grandfather had brought to everything else in his life, and slowly, deliberately, I began shaping it into something new, something that carried his name forward the way he deserved. The first thing I did with the profits, once I understood the business well enough to make real decisions about it, was establish the Walter Cole Pharmacy Scholarship, the same fund Preston had already drawn up 11 years earlier as a fallback in case I ever violated the trust, except now I activated it on my own terms, fully funded, awarding 4 full scholarships a year to first-generation pharmacy students who, like me, had grown up being told that being capable meant you didn't need anyone to invest in you. I read every application myself that first year, and I thought about a 7-year-old girl with a misspelled birthday cake every single time I found one that reminded me of who I used to be. The quiet ones, the responsible ones, the kids who had learned to stop asking for things, because nobody around them had ever taught them that wanting help was not the same as being weak. Bree and I are not close, not the way sisters in movies eventually become close after a story like this one. We talk maybe once every few months now, careful, honest conversations that neither of us rushes to fill with more warmth than actually exists between us yet. And I think that honesty is more valuable than the performance of closeness we spent our whole childhood being handed instead of the real thing. She got a job at a different boutique last year, working for someone else instead of trying to build something of her own from borrowed money, and the last time we spoke she told me, quietly, almost like she was surprised to hear herself say it, that she was starting to understand what our grandfather meant about the difference between being helped and being rescued, and that she thought, maybe, given enough time, she wanted to try learning the difference herself. I still keep one of my grandfather's letters in my desk drawer at the pharmacy office, the last one he ever sent me before the stroke, the one where he told me that being the strong one was never supposed to mean being the invisible one. I read it on hard days, on the days when old instincts creep back in, and I catch myself starting to apologize for taking up space in a room, and it reminds me every single time that somebody spent 20 years quietly keeping score after all, even when I thought no one was paying attention. Love was never supposed to be rationed out to the child who performed the loudest need for it, while the quiet one got told she was simply too strong to require any at all. If this story reminded you of anyone in your own life, a grandparent who saw you clearly when your own parents couldn't, or a sibling who somehow got more of everything while you got told you were just fine on your own? I want to hear about them in the comments below. Share this with the person who needs to hear that being capable was never supposed to mean being forgotten. And if you're new here, subscribe, because there is always another family, another table, and another quiet truth finally ready to be said out loud.